what consistently happens is the BBC pounces on every single reform mishap and gives it vastly disproportionate coverage in your news cycles and completely ignores the far more voluminous misdemeanors and frankly egregious things that people from other parties say. A Green Party council candidate made that same claim. The BBC has not even reported on that, Laura, and I think that's unbecoming of the BBC.
BBC is an absolute shock after Zia Yusuf walked into their own interview and completely tore through the script they tried to control. He questioned the BBC itself, challenged their framing, and put their credibility under direct pressure. This turned into a clash over energy costs, taxpayer spending, media bias, and what the BBC chooses to highlight or ignore.
So Laura, politics is about choices, right? Everyone understands that.
This was supposed to be one of those standard, predictable BBC interviews. Controlled questions, careful answers, nothing too uncomfortable. But within seconds, that entire script fell apart. The tone shifted fast. Zia Yusuf didn't walk in to play along. He wasn't there to give polished, safe responses. He came in ready to push back, and that's exactly what he did. Instead of staying inside the lines, he kept stepping outside them. And suddenly, what should have been a routine exchange turned into something messy, unpredictable, and honestly a bit chaotic.
So Laura, if you're entering a competition, you do need to offer some details, and no one is obliged to talk about how they voted. But the reason why we launched that competition is to draw attention to the fact that Reform is calling on this Labour government to change course and actually reverse all of these awful energy policies that the Tories put in place.
Because this wasn't just about one topic. It started pulling in everything. Media bias, energy bills, political hypocrisy, even serious accusations about what gets covered and what gets ignored. And at that point, the real question started forming. Was the BBC still running this interview, or had they already lost control of the narrative?
Well, I was chairman of the party for a significant portion of the last couple of years. I personally oversaw our GDPR and data compliance, and I'm very comfortable with our position on that. Are you putting to me that we're in breach of GDPR?
I'm not suggesting that at all. I'm asking you what you're going to do with it.
It all began with what looked like a simple setup. The BBC went straight for Reform's competition. This offer to pay a whole street's energy bills. On the surface, it sounds generous. But the angle they chose was very specific. Data, personal data, and privacy concerns.
Well, everything that Reform would do with the data is in the terms and conditions, which people have to opt in and specifically check a box to allow them to do. But let me reiterate, it's a competition, which could be worth quite a lot of money, a whole street of energy costs.
They framed it carefully. If people are entering this competition, they're giving up their email, maybe their address, possibly even information about how they vote. That's not a small thing. And the way the question was asked, it carried a tone, not neutral. More like, there's something wrong here and we're about to expose it. It was a subtle pressure move. Turn the conversation into a potential scandal before it even begins.
Number one, at the petrol pumps and the diesel pumps. So we're talking about an emergency halving of VAT and reversing this abominable increase in fuel duty that's coming. And on your home energy bills, we're talking about abolishing VAT completely and removing all the green levies.
But Yusuf didn't react the way most politicians would. No panic, no long-winded defense. He stayed calm, almost too calm, and then he flipped it. Completely. Instead of getting stuck explaining data policies, he zoomed out. He reframed the entire conversation. Suddenly, it wasn't about forms and GDPR anymore. It was about why they launched the competition in the first place, and that's where the real shift happened.
How are you going to pay for that then? So let's look at taking VAT off energy bills. That would be roughly, we expect to cost about $2.5 billion. Where would the money for that come from?
Yeah, so let's talk about that. So this is more than covered by stop spending British taxpayer money on things that don't improve their lives.
He went straight into energy. He started talking about what people are actually dealing with. Fuel prices, electricity bills, the cost of heating your home. And then he dropped the line that changes everything. Britain has some of the highest energy costs in the world. Now that hits differently because this isn't abstract anymore. This is what people feel every single month. And he didn't stop there. He pointed directly at the causes, green levies, VAT on energy, rising fuel duties. Policies that, according to him, are making life harder for ordinary people while politicians keep pushing the same agenda.
So we'd scrap the electric car subsidies. We would end the subsidies on heat pumps in your boiler. And we would end the insane experiment that's currently going on. £9 billion over the course of this Parliament, Labour is spending of British taxpayers' money on carbon capture experiments. Cumulatively, over the 5-year period, that is £14 billion, Laura. That more than covers all of the measures we're taking to reduce cost of living.
Then came the solutions. Not small tweaks. Big, clear moves. Remove VAT on energy bills. Scrap green levies completely. Cut fuel costs, petrol and diesel both. Whether you agree or not, it was direct. No complicated language. And just like that, the narrative flipped again. Now it wasn't about whether reform was collecting data. It was about whether the government, and by extension the system, was making everyday life unnecessarily expensive.
The whole reason we did that was to draw attention that we're going to save, the policies I just mentioned are going to save £200 off the annual home energy bill of the average British household during the cost of living crisis, and reduce petrol prices by 12p per litre and diesel prices by 14p a litre.
That's when the emotional weight really kicked in, because now you've got two sides forming very clearly. On one side, politicians defending policies, talking about long-term goals, climate commitments, future benefits. On the other side, people opening their energy bills and feeling that pressure immediately. And Yousaf leaned into that contrast hard. Then came what might be the most explosive part of the entire exchange, the moment where things stopped being just political and became personal.
What is totally unacceptable is walloping hard-working British people with the highest energy costs in the world as a direct result of green levies on people's bills, just so that virtue-signaling politicians can get on private jets and go to Davos and compete over who can be Greta Thunberg's best friend. That is the height of insanity.
He brought up what he called virtue-signaling politicians, and he didn't hold back. Talking about leaders flying to places like Davos, attending global events, competing over who can look the most committed to climate causes. Meanwhile, according to him, ordinary people are stuck making real choices, whether to turn the heating on, whether they can afford to fill their car. That contrast is powerful, it's emotional, and it sticks, because it creates a very clear image. Elites talking about saving the world, while regular people are struggling to get through the month. And that's where the interview really changed tone again. This wasn't just policy discussion anymore. It became a clash of realities.
This is more than covered by stop spending British taxpayer money on things that don't improve their life.
Yousaf wasn't just answering questions. He was building a narrative, one where the system feels disconnected, where decisions are being made far away from the people actually living with the consequences. And whether you agree with him or not, you can't ignore what happened next. Because at that point, the BBC wasn't leading the conversation anymore. They were reacting to it. And right when the pressure started building, the BBC stepped in with the question they always used to regain control. How are you going to pay for it? They brought numbers into it. Billions. Removing VAT on energy alone, around £2.5 billion. The message was clear. This sounds good, but does it actually add up? This is where most politicians slow down. They hedge, they stretch answers, they get technical.
Both of those industries support jobs in this country. So wouldn't costs go up and jobs in green industries be under threat by those decisions?
First of all, this is a fallacy. China is currently flooding this country with cheap Chinese electric cars. Currently, those levies that British taxpayers' money is being spent on are producing jobs and creating jobs in China and costing them in this country.
Yousaf didn't. He answered immediately and flipped the entire argument. Instead of talking about raising money, he focused on where money is already being spent. His point was blunt. The problem isn't a lack of funds, it's waste. Then he laid it out clearly. Scrap electric vehicle subsidies, end heat pump subsidies, cancel £9 billion in carbon capture spending.
The BBC has not even reported on that, Laura, and I think that's unbecoming of the BBC.
Zia Yousaf, we must end it there, but thank you very much indeed for coming into this studio this morning.
He framed it as a simple trade-off. Stop funding long-term experiments and redirect that money to reduce immediate costs for people. That shift matters, because now the question isn't, can you afford this? It becomes, why are you choosing to spend on that instead? And that's a much harder position to defend. Then the BBC moved to the next pressure point, jobs.
So Laura, politics is about choices, right? Everyone understands that. Firstly, the number of, quote, green jobs that have been created are dwarfed by the number of jobs lost as a result of the insane net zero policies. And reform is not ideologically opposed to renewables. If wind farms make sense economically on their own right, great. If solar farms make sense in their own right, and local residents are happy with it, more power to them.
If you cut all these green subsidies, what happens to the people working in those industries? Renewable energy, EV manufacturing, clean tech? These aren't small sectors anymore. The concern is real. Remove support, and jobs could disappear.
Reform is not ideologically opposed to renewables. If wind farms make sense economically on their own right, great. If solar farms make sense in their own right, and local residents are happy with it, more power to them.
But again, Yousaf didn't concede. He challenged the premise itself, said the scale of green jobs is overstated, and then he pushed further, arguing that many of these jobs aren't even staying in Britain. They're shifting to China. That changes the framing completely. It's no longer about protecting local jobs. It's about whether current policies are actually exporting them. Now, the divide becomes clear. On one side, long-term investment, sustainability, future. Industries. On the other, immediate cost relief, national control, short-term impact. Yousaf made it clear which side he was on. For him, this isn't about ideology, it's about priorities. What matters now, not what might work years later. And just when the discussion was grounded in economics, the tone shifted again, sharply.
That's actually incorrect, right? And I want to make an important point, because it was just a couple of days ago that Green Party activists and candidates made a series of horrible anti-Semitic comments, including describing Jews, and I quote, I hesitate to quote, but I will do it, calling them abominations on humanity. And they also claimed that the arson attacks on the Jewish charity ambulance were a quote, false flag. A Green Party council candidate made that same claim. The BBC has not even reported on that, Laura.
Yousaf introduced something the BBC hadn't brought up. He referenced alleged comments from Green Party activists, describing Jews as abominations, and claims that attacks on a Jewish charity were labeled as false flags. That's not a policy disagreement. That's a serious accusation. The entire conversation changed instantly. It moved from economic debate to moral accountability.
Proportionately, Zia Yousaf, proportionately Reform has lost more councillors over this kind of thing happening than the other political parties.
That is actually incorrect.
And then he directed the focus straight at the BBC. He accused them of ignoring it. That's a direct challenge to their role as a neutral broadcaster. From there, he expanded the argument, said this is part of a pattern. When Reform makes mistakes, it's everywhere, constant. Coverage, repeated focus. But when similar or more serious issues come from other parties, the response is different. This is where the interview stops being about individual claims and becomes about something bigger: media control. Who decides what gets attention, what gets amplified, and what gets ignored? Because that shapes how the public sees everything.
But I want to make a very important point actually on vetting and how these things are covered, because yes, of course, it's reasonable to hold Reform to account. But what consistently happens is the BBC pounces on every single Reform mishap and gives it vastly disproportionate coverage in your news cycles.
Yousaf's argument was clear. The BBC isn't just reporting events, it's influencing how those events are perceived. At that point, the dynamic had completely shifted. This wasn't the BBC questioning a guest anymore. It was a direct challenge to the BBC itself. And just when it looked like Yousaf had taken control, the BBC hit back.
Reform's had a pretty turbulent week with some of its candidates. One of them branded the former First Minister of Scotland, Humza Yousaf, an Islamist moron. Another candidate made offensive comments aimed at the Jewish community. Another was photographed doing a Nazi salute.
They started listing incidents, one after another. Candidates linked to offensive comments, accusations of Islamophobia, even a Nazi salute controversy. It was fast, sharp, and very intentional. The message was clear. You're talking about everyone else. But what about your own house? For a moment, it worked. It shifted pressure right back onto Reform. But Yousaf didn't deny it. He didn't panic either. He zoomed out. He said they vetted over 8,000 candidates. That's the scale. And then came the line, 99.9% success rate, meaning, yes, a few people slipped through, but in his view, that's not systemic failure. That's statistical reality, and that's where the clash sits. BBC framing it as a pattern, Yousaf framing it as probability. Same facts, completely different story. At this point, something bigger was happening. The BBC kept trying to pin him down, keep him focused, keep him answering. Yusuf did the opposite. He widened everything. Every question turned into a bigger argument, and slowly, the control started slipping. And now you're left with the bigger question. Was this an exposure of real bias and double standards? Or was it a smart deflection to avoid tough scrutiny?